China terrified of the truth getting out. Ooh.
Something is causing Chinese hospitals to overflow, and Chinese citizens aren't buying the government's explanation. Maybe the rest of the world shouldn't either. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Chinese hospitals are filling up like crazy, and what's driving people there are symptoms like coughing, trouble breathing, and fever. Children, in particular, are being affected. Plenty of adults are getting sick as well. In fact, the lines to get into some of these hospitals are so long, scalpers have been buying up the placeholder tickets and selling them to desperate families at profit. I would like to think there's a special place in hell reserved for people like that.
Čia ne taip senai, prieš 2 savaitės jau.
Already we're seeing the big whites, or dabai as they're called in China, spraying disinfectant all over the place. The State Council's Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism has called for epidemic control measures at ports. It's also telling local governments to stockpile medications, especially pediatric drugs, and exhaust all means to increase pediatric service capacity. What has really set off alarm bells, though, was when the notification system that alerted the world to COVID-19 put out a warning in November saying that there's an undiagnosed pneumonia spreading around China. This prompted the World Health Organization to ask China for more info. China basically responded with, "Nothing to see here, just some seasonal illnesses," and said it's got everything under control. That sounds oddly familiar.
Worrying news out of China. The country is reporting a large spike in the number of cases of a new form of viral pneumonia.
Extra health screenings have been...
No way, no shot.
This will be complicated. It's flu season, and flu can give you fever and symptoms very similar.
Chinese authorities say they have the situation under control.
Those clips were all taken from the beginning of 2020, when reports of a viral pneumonia in China were spreading around the world. Now, at the time, China had already admitted an unknown coronavirus was on the loose. That is, after it couldn't cover it up anymore. What is China's story this time around? I'll tell you right after the break. Welcome.
Ne, čia būtų ne Return of the Virus, o kaip ten tas COVID-2, kaip ten tas, bagalų, kaip ten tas vadinas. Čia pas mus tai būtų labiau nežinau kas. Kaip tas mokytoja grįžta, nežinau. Mums būtų vietinis kažkoks, žinai. COVID-2 ir ten šeimam ar šiai atakuoja klonų karai.
Chinese hospitals are flooded with people, primarily children.
Bet esmės nežinau, ar dabar taip būtų lengva nuslėpti kažką ar panašiai, nes, tipo, nu, kiek suprantu, seka dabar ir kilmė, ir tos skirtingus variantus ir panašiai, ten tas atšakas, tai jeigu ten daitų iki kažkur ir rastų, kad, nu, naujas iš tikrųjų kažkoks ten strainas ar kažką, tai man atrodo, nu, ir daitų iki vakarų pasaulio, man atrodo, greitai, nu, pamatytų, man atrodo, dabar nesigautų taip ten nuslėpti kažkaip ar panašiai, bet, nu, gal ir gautus, ką ten gali žinoti. Partner anniversary, mačiau šitą, bet nežinau, useless. Nieko, jau greit ir YouTube streaminsim, tai ne tik Twitch'e. Soon.tm.
From symptoms like cough, difficulty breathing, and fever. The Chinese government says that several seasonal illnesses are behind the spike in hospitalizations that started in October. They say they are pretty common diseases like the flu, mycoplasma pneumonia, and RSV. Some of them, like mycoplasma pneumonia and RSV, are more likely to infect kids than adults. The government says there are a few reasons for the spike. One is that cold weather often brings on seasonal illnesses like these. Another is what's called the immunity gap pneumonia. During the COVID lockdowns, everyone, but especially kids, weren't being exposed to these seasonal illnesses, and so their immune systems weren't able to build up their defenses. Now that the lockdowns have ended, people are being exposed to them, and their immunity isn't as good as it once was. Which is plausible, since in 2022, the immunity gap was held responsible for the surge of RSV and flu cases in the United States as well. The last reason the Chinese government gives is that some of the illnesses I mentioned before are cyclical, which means there's a natural spike in them every few years. Take mycoplasma pneumonia, for example. It tends to spike every 3 to 7 years, and since China was in lockdown for 3 years, it's no surprise that it would be making a comeback. All of that makes sense, but as usual, it's what the Chinese government isn't saying that's worrying. Chinese state media have gone out of their way to assure the public that all these illnesses are treatable. A National Health Commission spokesperson assured the public that medical workers had mature treatment plans to deal with them. But what they don't say is how these illnesses aren't responding to normal treatments. Take mycoplasma pneumonia again, for example. It can usually be treated with over-the-counter medications, but if that doesn't work, there are antibiotics that can treat it as well. However, there are reports that this surge is not responding to antibiotics. The Chinese government says that the local mycoplasma pneumonia strain has high resistance to certain antibiotics. And that seems likely. It's been well documented in scientific studies that China overprescribes antibiotics. And that's a problem because it creates illnesses that are resistant to them. What are normally mild seasonal illnesses can become a lot harder to treat once they've developed that antibiotic.
Lemba, aš vos nepasakiau tokio, tada senai sakiau, na, kol kas, neaišku čia, kas iš to bus ar nebus, tiesiog žiūrėsim ir stebėsim. Aš tą pasakiau, kiek ten keli tūkstančiai buvo dar tik Kinijoje. Ir tada po mėnesį jau kalbam, ar ten po 2 mėnesių jau kalbam, kaip visam pasaulyje pandemija ten ir panašiai ir panašiai. Tai dabar vos to nepasakiau, blėt. Bet realiai čia mes tiesiog turim laukti ir žiūrėti, ar kažkas iš to bus ar ne, nes čia neaišku, čia reikia panikuoti ar nereikia, bet Jesus. Niekad negali žinoti, kuris čia bus tas sekantis.
Resistance to certain types of antibiotics used to treat children with mycoplasma pneumonia can be as high as 90%. In the US and Europe, it's closer to 10%. This could be why China has been pushing people towards alternatives like vaccines and traditional Chinese medicine. But according to the Epoch Times, media reports and posts on social media indicate that doctors in China have tried all kinds of antibiotics and other drugs with no success. A World Health Organization official says they're following up with China about why that is. Even if it is just plain old antibiotic-resistant mycoplasma pneumonia, that's a reason for concern. One epidemiology professor at UCLA warns that we do need to worry about potential transmission of mycoplasma pneumonia through international travel, which might lead to an increased proportion of the mycoplasma-infected individuals with resistant strains that will be difficult to be treated. Right now, the World Health Organization isn't recommending any travel restrictions, and we're not aware of any countries that have any. But a few countries are shoring up their defenses in other ways. And several congressional Republicans in the U.S. are asking the White House for a travel ban. There have been spikes in child pneumonia cases in places like Ireland, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark. And in the U.S., the states of Ohio and Massachusetts are seeing more cases than usual. But right now, pretty much every government is taking China at its word that there's nothing truly dangerous going around. And that's a pretty big oversight. I'll tell you why after this final commercial break.
Tell us why.
Welcome back. So the official narrative from the Chinese government is that China's just dealing with a surge of relatively mild diseases that are proliferating because China's lockdowns finally ended. We've seen spikes like this when other countries came out of lockdowns, so it's a plausible explanation. But, surprise, surprise, people in China aren't buying that explanation. Many are worried this is either something new or a mutated version of COVID-19, and something does seem to be off. According to Nature magazine, what is unusual, say epidemiologists, is the high prevalence of pneumonia in China. When COVID-19 restrictions were eased in other countries, influenza and RSV drove most spikes in illness. So why is it being driven by pneumonia in China? There's more. I mentioned before about the ProMed report that alerted the WHO something was up. Well, it said a number of sources seem to suggest mycoplasma pneumonia as a cause of the infections, but little clinical information is available. The reported lack of cough with an illness with high fever and nodularity on chest radiographs is unusual for this pathogen. This has made specialists question whether these new clusters of pneumonia could be caused by a novel pathogen. Whatever it is, it's no fun. I've been in contact with someone in China who got sick with something that was simply diagnosed as upper tract respiratory infection. They said it was way worse than COVID, and that almost everyone either seemed to have had it or knows someone who did. Then there's the cover-up side of this story. A Chinese government insider told the Epoch Times that the government has been ordering officials to downplay the whole thing, especially the spread of COVID-19. It makes sense.
Tipo, Kinija dabar savo į tokią vietą pastatė, kad net jeigu būtų naujo, bet kažkoks naujas ar kažką, kaip čia, Visų pirma, jeigu jie pasakytų iškart paniką, jeigu jie pasakytų naujas, iškart paniką pradeda, nes žmonės, o jie pasakė, tai čia turbūt 100 kartų blogiau negu COVID'as, nes apie COVID'ą žinai slėpia ilgą laiką, jeigu nesako, vis tiek niekas netikė. Tai tipo tokia situacija, kad can't win now. Kai su vienu taip prigavo tave, tai dabar kaip jie turėtų elgtis, dabar įsivaizduokit, jo, Kinijoje vat naujas kažkoks COVID atmaina, ar iš vis naujas kažkoks virusas, kur tipo šitaip, tai kaip jiem elgtis? Nieko nesakys. Arba jeigu tikrai iš tikrųjų nieko žalingo ten ypatingai nėra, koks nors, senas gal koks labai ar panašiai ten, toks panašus, žinai. Jeigu jie tą pasakys, jie čia daug blogiau negu iš tikrųjų yra. Jeigu mėgins nuslėpti, nes, ne tik nuslėpti, bet nekalbės apie tai, nes iš tikrųjų nieko blogo, vis tiek galvos žmonės, kad, aš nežinau, kaip jiem dabar reiktų elgtis, bet tai būna, kaip pasitikėjimas susipis. Labas, Skirmante, partner anniversary, Nasty Pixel, labas.
That's when you look at how badly China's economy is doing right now. China is desperately trying to convince foreign investors that it's on the up and up after its lockdowns took a wrecking ball to the economy. And that's kind of hard to do if investors think China's ground zero for the next pandemic. So you can see why the government would want to keep this under wraps. And it's very important for Beijing to convince the World Health Organization because a lot of governments you from the WHO. Which is a little sad considering how little credibility the WHO has after COVID-19. The other sad thing is that the WHO seems to be basically taking China's word at face value. It says in its summary that there is limited detailed information available to fully characterize the overall risk of these reported cases of respiratory illness in children. But then it concludes that because China's rationale seems credible, there's no reason to be suspicious. Did the WHO not learn anything from China's cover-ups of SARS and COVID? With the added incentive to cover up anything that would turn away foreign investment, the WHO should be taking anything China says with a grain of salt, the size of an iceberg. Now, this isn't proof of anything, but China's famous Batwoman virologist warned in September that another coronavirus-like outbreak was likely to happen. Of course, Chinese media refuted that claim. But there's harder evidence that China's dealing with a coronavirus spread. Several Chinese pharmaceutical companies recently got new COVID-19 vaccines approved for emergency use. Authorities have also reinstated COVID-19 control measures, including PCR testing and health codes in various locations nationwide. It would be strange if China weren't dealing with COVID, actually. Even in the US, where lockdowns were lifted much earlier than China, there are still about 15,000 infections and 1,000 new deaths a week.
You can go to our website right now and see that RSV season is in full swing. The flu season is just beginning across most of the country, though accelerating fast. And while we're seeing relatively low levels of COVID, COVID is still the primary cause of new respiratory hospitalizations and deaths.
So do I think there's definitely a novel coronavirus spread?
Maybe.
No, there's just not enough information.
Yeah.
I think there's a good chance there's something going around that the government is keeping under wraps. But that doesn't mean China doesn't also have a bunch of seasonal illnesses and some good old COVID-19 mixed in as well. Now, we have a lot of problems covering.
Aš laikaus tos pačios pozicijos, man atrodo, kad dabar seka tuos variantus ir juos atpažįsta. Tipo, jos turi kaip ten sequencing, aš nežinau, ten, pagal, tarkim, pagal kodą DNR kokį nors tos lygos, I don't know, kaip jie tą padaro, bet realiai atpažįsta skirtingus variantus, ten kilmę atseka ir gan greitai. Tai man atrodo dabar, jeigu toks ir būtų pradėtas ten ar Amerikoje, ten ar kažkur ten Europoje fiksuojamas, jie dalinas tam duomenim, kiek žinau, agentūros. Tai jeigu pradėtų dalintis, ir plisti, tai yra ne Kinijoje, kažkoks naujas ar labai iš karto mes dabar kaip ir žinotume, man atrodo, ten. Tai kad čia Kinijoje, jeigu kažkas vyksta, gal kažkas ir vyksta, bet reiškia dar pasaulyje nėra, kad reikėtų dėl kažko pergyventi. Nes jo, ten kaip pirmas buvo sure, ir tai galų gale, tos įstaigos būtent taip ir susiekė ten, iš kur ta kilmė buvo, ir ten galų gale. Bet dabar, kaip suprantu, nėra ypatingos čia baimės, kad Kinijoje kažkas šeidi daros, kada ten kažkas šeidi nesidaro. Tai čia spėlioti ir pergyventi, kas ten daros, faktai neverta. Tai jo, tai tiek. Tai gerai, tai tiek, jo, okei. We're done su šito. Koks vakaras ilgas, kaip širdin
Paskink man Jėzumi.